Dana, a single mother in her late 30s, had turned her bedroom into a private dance studio. The sleek metal pole stood in the corner, glinting under the soft glow of the fairy lights she'd strung along the ceiling. It was her escape, a way to shed the weight of her responsibilities and reconnect with herself. She stood in front of the floor-length mirror, taking a moment to admire her reflection. Years of dedication to pole dancing had sculpted her body into a lean, toned masterpiece. Her abs were defined, her legs long and powerful, and her arms bore the strength of someone who could support her own weight with ease. Tonight, she wore a black lace bodysuit that clung to her curves like a second skin. The material was sheer in just the right places, revealing hints of her tan skin beneath. Her hair, a cascade of dark waves, fell freely over her shoulders, and her lips were painted a deep crimson that matched the boldness of her movements. The first beats of a sultry R&B track began to play through her Bluetooth speaker, and Dana closed her eyes, letting the music flow through her. She stepped toward the pole, her fingers brushing against the cool metal. The first spin was always her favorite, a moment of pure surrender. She gripped the pole with both hands, lifted her body effortlessly, and began to spin. The world blurred around her, and for a moment, she felt weightless, free. As the song progressed, her movements became more intricate. She transitioned into an invert, her legs hooking around the pole as she hung upside down. Her core muscles flexed, holding her in place as she extended her arms gracefully, her body forming a perfect line. The sensation of the pole against her skin was electrifying, a reminder of her own strength and femininity. She moved into a floor routine, her body gliding across the polished wood. Her hips swayed with the rhythm, and she arched her back in a way that was both powerful and seductive. The black lace bodysuit shimmered under the light, accentuating every curve and line of her body. She was a vision of confidence and sensuality, completely lost in the moment. Next, she transitioned into a fan kick, her legs extending elegantly before wrapping around the pole again. She slid down slowly, her body moving with a fluidity that spoke of years of practice. Her hands trailed down her sides, emphasizing the curves of her hips, before she rolled onto the floor in a dramatic move. She pushed herself up into a backbend, her chest rising and falling with the rhythm of the music. The bodysuit clung to her, the lace catching the light and casting intricate shadows on her skin. With the beat of the music intensifying, Dana moved into a split grip spin, her body twisting around the pole in a series of controlled, graceful rotations. Her hair flew around her face, adding to the dramatic effect. She ended the spin with a drop, her body descending into a controlled fall, only to catch herself at the last moment, her legs wrapping around the pole once more. As the music softened, Dana transitioned into a slow, sensual routine. She slid down the pole, her hands trailing lightly along its surface, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She arched her back, her hips swaying in time with the beat, her eyes half-lidded as she lost herself in the rhythm. Her fingers brushed against her thighs, tracing the lines of her body as she moved. The bodysuit, already revealing, seemed to enhance her every movement, making her feel both powerful and vulnerable. She leaned back against the pole, her body curving like a bowstring, her hair cascading behind her. The music swelled, and she spun into a final pose, one leg extended, the other wrapped around the pole, her arms outstretched. She held the pose for a moment, her chest rising and falling with the effort, a triumphant smile playing on her lips. The door creaked open, the sound slicing through the lingering notes of the music. Dana froze mid-motion, her body stiffening as she turned her head sharply toward the intrusion. Standing in the doorway was Brandon, her 20-year-old son, his eyes wide with shock. He was dressed casually in a hoodie and sweatpants, his dark hair slightly disheveled as if he'd just woken up from a nap. His hand still rested on the doorknob, his fingers gripping it tightly, the knuckles white. His eyes, usually so calm and collected, were now wide with a mix of surprise, curiosity, and something else she couldn't quite place. For a moment, neither of them moved. The room felt impossibly still, the air thick with tension. Dana's heart pounded in her chest, her breath catching in her throat. She could feel the heat of embarrassment creeping up her neck, her cheeks flushing crimson. Her hands instinctively moved to cover herself, though the black lace bodysuit left little to the imagination. "Mom," Brandon finally said, his voice low and uncertain. It wasn't a question, but a statement, as if he was trying to process what he just walked in on. Dana swallowed hard, her mind racing for an explanation. "Brandon," she began, her voice shaky, I didn't hear you come in." He didn't respond immediately. His gaze flickered from her face down to her outfit, lingering for a moment on the sheer lace that clung to her curves before he quickly averted his eyes. His cheeks flushed, and he cleared his throat awkwardly. "What are you doing?" he asked, his tone a mix of disbelief and confusion. "It's just a workout," Dana replied quickly, though her voice lacked conviction. She crossed her arms over her chest, trying to shield herself from his gaze. "Pole dancing? It's a form of exercise." Brandon's eyebrows shot up, his expression incredulous. "Exercise?" he repeated, his voice tinged with skepticism. Dana nodded, though she felt her resolve wavering. "Yes, exercise. It's not what you think. It's about strength, flexibility. It's an art form." Brandon didn't respond immediately. His gaze drifted past her to the pole, then back to her face. She could see the gears turning in his mind, trying to piece together what he just witnessed. His eyes narrowed slightly, as if he was trying to reconcile the image of his mother, the woman who packed his lunches and nagged him about cleaning his room, with the woman who had just been spinning gracefully around a pole in a revealing bodysuit. "I didn't know you did this," he said finally, his tone softer now, though still laced with confusion. Dana sighed, running a hand through her hair. "It's something I do for myself," she admitted, her voice steadying as she spoke. "It's empowering. It makes me feel strong, confident. It's not just about the dance. It's about owning who I am." Brandon didn't respond immediately. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly unsure of how to process what she'd just told him. His gaze flickered back to the pole, then to her outfit, and finally to her face. "I didn't mean to interrupt," he said awkwardly, his voice quiet. "It's fine," Dana replied, though her voice was tight. "Just knock next time, okay?" Brandon nodded, his face flushing slightly. "Yeah, sorry," he muttered, his tone sheepish. He lingered for a moment longer, his eyes darting back to the pole before he turned and left the room, closing the door softly behind him. Dana stood frozen in place, her heart still racing, her hands trembling slightly. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She glanced at herself in the mirror, her reflection a mix of vulnerability and defiance. The black lace bodysuit still clung to her body, the intricate details of the fabric catching the light. Her hair was slightly tousled, and her cheeks were still flushed from the intensity of the moment. She looked like a different person, confident, sensual, free. But now that freedom felt threatened, she walked over to the pole, her fingers brushing against its cool surface. It had been her sanctuary, her escape from the world, but now it felt like a spotlight, exposing her in a way she hadn't anticipated. Taking a deep breath, she straightened her shoulders. This wasn't something she should be ashamed of. Pole dancing was an art, a form of self-expression, and she wasn't going to let anyone, not even her own son, make her feel otherwise. But as she turned off the lights and got ready for bed, she couldn't shake the image of Brandon's wide-eyed expression. Something had shifted between them, and she wasn't entirely sure what it meant. The morning after the incident, the apartment felt different, charged with a tension that hadn't been there before. Dana woke up early, her thoughts still tangled with the events of the previous night. She could hear Brandon moving around in his room, the faint sound of his footsteps echoing through the hallway. She hesitated, unsure of how to approach him. When she finally made her way to the kitchen, Brandon was already there, seated at the table with a bowl of cereal in front of him. He didn't look up as she entered, his focus seemingly fixed on his phone. Dana cleared her throat softly, trying to gauge his mood. "Morning," she greeted, her voice casual, despite the weight in her chest. Brandon glanced up briefly, giving her a quick nod. "Morning," he replied, his tone neutral but distant. The silence that followed was thick, filled with unspoken words and lingering awkwardness. Dana busied herself with making coffee, her hands moving automatically as her mind raced. She wanted to say something, anything to break the tension, but the words felt stuck in her throat. Finally, as she poured herself a cup of coffee, she turned to him. "Did you sleep okay?" she asked, her voice softer now. Brandon shrugged, still avoiding her gaze. "Yeah, fine," he mumbled, his tone non-committal. Donna hesitated, then took a seat across from him at the table. She sipped her coffee, the warmth of the liquid doing little to ease the chill in the air. "Look, about last night," she began, but Brandon cut her off. "It's fine," he said quickly, his voice clipped. "You don't have to explain." Dana studied him for a moment, noticing the way his jaw tightened and his fingers drummed restlessly on the table. "I want to, though," she said gently. "I feel like I owe you that much." Brandon didn't respond immediately. He set his phone down and finally looked at her, his expression a mix of curiosity and discomfort. "It's just unexpected," he admitted, his voice low. "I didn't know you did something like that." Dana nodded, her gaze steady. "I know it's not something I've talked about much, but it's something I've been doing for a while now. It's important to me." Brandon seemed to consider her words, his brow furrowing slightly. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his tone more curious than accusatory. Dana sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I don't know," she admitted. "I guess I was worried about how you'd react. It's not exactly mainstream, you know. Some people don't understand it." Brandon nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to his cereal. "I get that," he said quietly. "But it's kind of cool, I guess, if it makes you happy." Dana's lips twitched into a small smile, relief washing over her. "It does," she said softly. "It makes me feel strong, confident. It's more than just dance. It's about owning who I am." Brandon looked up at her again, his expression less guarded now. "You looked really good," he said hesitantly, his cheeks tinged with pink. Donna raised an eyebrow, caught off guard by the compliment. Thanks, she replied, her tone light but cautious. The conversation lapsed into silence again, but the tension had eased somewhat. Brandon finished his cereal and stood to rinse his bowl in the sink. As he turned to leave the kitchen, Dana spoke up again. Brandon, she said, her voice firm but gentle. Thank you for not judging me. He paused in the doorway, glancing back at her. You're my mom, he said simply. I don't want to make you feel like you have to hide things from me. Dana felt a lump form in her throat, her eyes misting slightly. That means a lot, she said quietly. Brandon gave her a small, awkward smile before disappearing down the hallway. Dana sat back in her chair, her thoughts swirling. The conversation had gone better than she'd expected, but there was still a sense of unease lingering in the air. She knew things between them had changed, but she wasn't sure how to navigate this new dynamic. As the day wore on, Dana found herself feeling more restless than usual. She tried to focus on her work, but her mind kept drifting back to the pole in her bedroom. It had been her escape, her way of reconnecting with herself, and now it felt like it had been tainted by the awkwardness of the previous night. In a bold move, she decided to reclaim it. She changed into one of her more daring outfits, a red satin bodysuit with intricate lace details that hugged her curves perfectly. She styled her hair into loose waves and applied a bold red lipstick that matched the outfit. As she stood in front of the mirror, she felt a surge of confidence. This was who she was, and she wasn't going to let anyone, not even her son, take that away from her. She set up her Bluetooth speaker and selected a playlist of sultry, rhythmic tracks. As the music filled the room, she stepped toward the pole, her fingers brushing against its smooth surface. The first spin was hesitant, her body stiff from the tension of the previous night. But as the music enveloped her, she began to relax, her movements becoming more fluid. She moved into an invert, her legs hooking around the pole as her body arched gracefully. The sensation of the cool metal against her skin was familiar, grounding. She transitioned into a floor routine, her hips swaying with the rhythm of the music. The red satin bodysuit shimmered under the light, accentuating every curve and line of her body. She was a vision of confidence and sensuality, completely lost in the moment. As she continued to dance, she became aware of a presence in the doorway. She glanced over and saw Brandon standing there, his arms crossed as he leaned against the frame. He didn't speak, but his eyes were focused on her, his expression unreadable. Dana didn't stop dancing. Instead, she embraced the spotlight, her movements becoming more deliberate and bold. She spun around the pole, her body twisting and arching in ways that were both powerful and seductive. When she finally came to a stop, she looked at Brandon, her chest rising and falling with the effort. For a moment, they just stared at each other, the silence between them charged with something unspoken. Dana stood by the pole, her breath coming in soft, controlled waves as she held Brandon's gaze. The air between them was thick with a tension neither of them could fully name. Brandon's expression was a mix of admiration and something else, curiosity perhaps, or even intrigue. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly unsure of how to proceed. I didn't mean to interrupt, Brandon said finally, his voice quiet but steady. Dana wiped a strand of hair from her face, giving him a small, knowing smile. You're not interrupting, she replied, her tone calm despite the flutter in her chest. I'm just practicing. Brandon nodded, his eyes lingering on the pole before flicking back to her. It's impressive, he admitted, his tone sincere. I didn't realize how much skill was involved. Dana's smile widened, a spark of pride igniting within her. It's not just about the moves, she explained, stepping away from the pole to face him fully. It's about strength controlling confidence. It's an art form. Brandon seemed to consider this, his brow furrowing slightly. It's different than I imagined, he said, his voice thoughtful. You make it look effortless. Dana chuckled softly, brushing her hands against her thighs. Trust me, it's not effortless. It's taken years of practice to get here. For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of the unspoken hanging between them. Dana could see the wheels turning in his mind, the questions forming behind his eyes. She braced herself, knowing that this was uncharted territory for both of them. Finally, Brandon broke the silence. Would you dance for me? The question caught Dana off guard, her breath hitching in her chest. She studied his face, searching for any hint of mockery or discomfort, but all she saw was genuine curiosity. You want me to dance for you? She repeated, her tone cautious. Brandon nodded, his expression earnest. Yeah, I mean, if you're comfortable with it. I want to see it the way you do, not as something to be embarrassed about, but as something beautiful. Dana's heart skipped a beat, her chest tightening at his words. It was a bold request, one that pushed the boundaries of their relationship, but there was something in his tone, something that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't in a long time. She hesitated, her mind racing. This was risky. She knew that, but it was also an opportunity, a chance to share something deeply personal with her son, to bridge the gap that had formed between them. Okay, she said finally, her voice steady, despite the nerves bubbling in her stomach. But not tonight. Tomorrow evening, I'll prepare something. Brandon's eyes lit up, a small smile tugging at his lips. Really? Dana nodded, returning his smile. Really? But you have to promise me something. What? You'll keep an open mind, she said, her tone firm but gentle. This isn't about what you think it's about. It's about art, strength, and self-expression. Brandon nodded quickly, his expression serious. I promise. Dana studied him for a moment, searching for any sign of hesitation or discomfort. When she found none, she exhaled softly, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. Good, she said, her voice softening. Then I'll see you tomorrow. Brandon smiled, giving her a small nod before turning to leave the room. Dana watched him go, her heart racing as she processed what had just happened. She had agreed to dance for him, to share something deeply personal and vulnerable. As she turned back to the pole, she felt a mixture of nervousness and excitement. This was uncharted territory, but it was also an opportunity to connect with her son in a way she hadn't before. She spent the rest of the evening planning her routine, selecting music that matched the mood she wanted to create. She wanted it to be bold, yet graceful, sensual, yet empowering. It was a delicate balance, but one she was determined to achieve. When she finally climbed into bed that night, her mind was still racing, but there was also a sense of purpose. Tomorrow evening would be a turning point for her, for Brandon, and for their relationship. The next morning, Dana woke up with a mix of anticipation and nerves. Coursing through her, she had promised Brandon a performance, and now she had to deliver. The thought of dancing for her son in such an intimate way was both exhilarating and daunting, but she was determined to make it a moment they could both remember, not as something awkward, but as a celebration of self-expression and connection. She spent the early hours of the day preparing, her mind focused on every detail. She chose her outfit carefully, a deep emerald green bodysuit with intricate gold detailing that accentuated her figure. The fabric clung to her curves, shimmering softly under the light. She paired it with sheer black stockings and high heels that added an extra layer of elegance to the ensemble. Her hair she styled into loose waves that cascaded down her back, and she applied a soft smoky eye with a bold red lip to complete the look. As she stood in front of the mirror, she took a moment to admire the reflection staring back. The outfit was daring, but tasteful, a perfect reflection of the confidence she wanted to exude. She felt a surge of empowerment, a reminder of why pole dancing had become such an important part of her life. The rest of the day passed in a blur as she set the stage for the evening. She rearranged the furniture in her bedroom to create an open space around the pole, dimmed the lights, and added a few candles to create a warm, intimate atmosphere. She selected a playlist that blended sultry rhythmic tracks with softer, more melodic pieces, ensuring the routine would have both intensity and grace. As the evening approached, Dana's nerves began to spike. She paced the room, her heart racing as she went over her routine in her head. She wanted it to be perfect, not just for Brandon, but for herself. This was her chance to share a piece of who she was, to show him that pole dancing was more than just a hobby. It was a form of art, a way of reclaiming her identity. When the sound of footsteps in the hallway signaled Brandon's arrival, Dana took a deep breath, steadying herself. She turned toward the door just as he appeared, dressed casually in jeans and a hoodie, his hands shoved into his pockets. "Hey," he greeted, his tone casual, but his eyes betraying his curiosity. "Hey," Dana replied, her voice warm despite the butterflies in her stomach. She leaned casually against the pole, a playful smirk playing on her lips. "Got some spare cash? You might want to tip me." Brandon blinked, caught off guard by her teasing tone. A small laugh escaped him, and he shook his head, his cheeks tinging pink. "Do I need to?" he asked, his voice light but slightly nervous. Dana shrugged, her smirk widening. "Only if you enjoy the show," she quipped, her tone dripping with playful mischief. Brandon chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. All right, I'll keep my wallet handy," he joked, though his voice was tinged with a mix of amusement and uncertainty. Dana gestured for him to take a seat on the edge of her bed, which she had positioned as the perfect viewing spot. "Just relax and enjoy the show," she said, her tone light but confident. Bond complied, sitting down and leaning back slightly, his gaze fixed on her. Dana could see the curiosity in his eyes, but there was also a sense of respect that made her feel at ease. She walked over to her Bluetooth speaker and pressed play, the first notes of the music filling the room. The soft, melodic intro set the tone, and Dana stepped toward the pole, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She placed one hand on the smooth metal, her fingers trailing lightly along its surface, as she began to sway her hips in time with the rhythm. As the music built, so did her movements. She spun around the pole, her body twisting and arching with a fluidity that was both powerful and graceful. The emerald green bodysuit shimmered under the soft light, catching Brandon's eye as he watched, transfixed. Dana moved into an invert, her legs hooking around the pole as she arched her back, her arms extending gracefully. She held the pose for a moment before sliding down slowly, her body curving elegantly as she transitioned into a floor routine. The music shifted to a more upbeat tempo, and Dana's movements became bolder, her hips swaying with a confidence that was impossible to ignore. She spun around the pole, her hair flying around her face as she executed a series of intricate moves that showcased her strength and skill. For a moment, Brandon couldn't look away. His eyes were glued to Dana as she moved with a grace and confidence he had never seen before. The way her body twisted and arched around the pole was mesmerizing, and he found himself captivated by every spin, every stretch, every daring pose. His admiration for her grew with each passing second, and the initial awkwardness he'd felt melted away, replaced by a sense of awe and respect. As the dance progressed, Dana began to shed layers, her movements becoming bolder and more daring. She peeled off a sheer black wrap, tossing it aside with a flourish, and then removed a delicate lace panel that had been draped over her shoulders. Each reveal felt deliberate, calculated to enhance the artistry of her performance, rather than to provoke. Brandon watched, his breath catching in his throat, completely transfixed. When Dana slid down the pole into a low, sultry pose, her eyes locked onto his, something shifted between them. The room seemed to shrink, the air thickening with an unspoken tension. Brandon felt his heart race, his body responding in ways he hadn't anticipated. Without thinking, he stood up, his hand fumbling in his pocket for his wallet. He pulled out a few bills, his movements almost automatic, as if he were caught in a trance. Dana, still moving to the rhythm of the music, raised an eyebrow as she saw him approaching. Her playful smirk returned, her voice teasing as she spoke. "Tipping the performer already? I didn't know you were such a generous audience." Brandon's cheeks flushed, but he didn't back down. He stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "You earned it," he said, his voice low but steady. Dana's smirk softened into a smile, and she tilted her head slightly, her eyes sparkling with amusement. "Well, if you insist," she murmured, her tone light, but with a hint of something deeper. Brandon hesitated for just a moment before reaching out, his fingers brushing against her skin as he tucked the bills into the waistband of her panties. The brief contact sent a jolt of electricity through both of them, and their eyes met, the tension between them palpable. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. The music seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the sound of their breathing and the pounding of their hearts. And then, almost as if it were the most natural thing in the world, Brandon leaned in, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was both tender and electrifying. Dana's hands found their way to his shoulders, her fingers curling into the fabric of his hoodie as she kissed him back. The kiss was slow and deliberate, a quiet acknowledgement of the connection that had been building between them all evening. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional, a silent understanding that they had crossed a line they couldn't uncross. When they finally pulled away, the room was silent except for the faint hum of the music. Brandon's cheeks were flushed, his breathing uneven, and Dana's eyes were wide with a mix of surprise and something deeper, something that looked a lot like longing. "That was unexpected," Dana said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Brandon nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor as he rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. "Yeah," he admitted, his tone sheepish. I didn't mean for that to happen." And Dana reached out, her hand gently cupping his chin and lifting his gaze back to hers. It's okay, she said, her voice warm but firm. We'll figure this out together. Brandon swallowed hard, his eyes searching hers for reassurance. When he found it, he nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. Together, he echoed, his voice quiet but steady. Dana gave him a small, reassuring smile, her hand dropping back to her side. Let's take this one step at a time, she said, her tone gentle but firm. We've got a lot to talk about, but for now, let's just breathe. Okay? Brandon nodded again, his expression softening. Okay, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The air between them was thick with anticipation as Dana led Brandon to the couch in the living room. The dim light of the room cast soft flickering shadows on the walls, creating an intimate and almost dreamlike atmosphere. Dana's movements were fluid and deliberate, her hips swaying to the rhythm of the unspoken tension that had been building between them all evening. Brandon sat on the couch, his back pressed against the cushions, his eyes never leaving her as she began to dance without the pole. He felt a strange mixture of emotions, nervousness, admiration, and a growing sense of desire that he couldn't quite suppress. His hands gripped the edge of the couch, his knuckles whitening as he tried to steady his breathing. Dana moved closer, her body brushing against his, the warmth of her skin sending a shiver down his spine. Her fingers trailed lightly over his shoulders, her touch both teasing and inviting. She leaned in, her lips close to his ear, her breath warm against his skin as she whispered, "Relax, just enjoy the show." Brandon swallowed hard, his throat dry as he nodded. "I'm trying," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Dana smiled, her expression playful, but with a hint of something deeper. She stepped back slightly, her hips swaying to the rhythm of an imaginary beat as she continued to dance. Her movements were slow and deliberate, each spin and stretch designed to captivate him. Her eyes remained locked onto his, the intensity of her gaze making it impossible for him to look away. She reached out, her fingers tracing a delicate path along his jawline, her touch light but electric. Brandon's breath hitched, his heart racing in his chest as he tried to process what was happening. He had never seen his mother like this, so confident, so sensual, so utterly mesmerizing. Dana's smile widened as she noticed his reaction. "You're doing great," she teased, her voice filled with amusement. "Just keep watching." She moved closer again, her body brushing against his as she leaned in, her lips close to his ear. "You're not shy, are you?" she whispered, her tone teasing, but with a hint of something more. Brandon shook his head, his voice steady despite the nerves that churned in his stomach. "No," he replied, his tone firm. Dana chuckled softly, the sound low and sultry. Her fingers trailed down his chest, the touch feather light but deliberate. She could feel the tension in his body, the way his muscles tensed under her fingertips. It was clear that he was struggling to stay composed, and she found his reaction both endearing and thrilling. Finally, she settled onto his lap, her weight pressing lightly against him. She felt something hard beneath her, and a mischievous smile played on her lips. Without breaking eye contact, she shifted slightly, her hips grinding against his arousal as she leaned in closer, her breath warm against his ear. "Someone's impressed," she teased, her voice low and sultry. Brandon's cheeks flushed, but he didn't pull away. Instead, his hands found their way to her waist, his grip firm but gentle. "Can you blame me?" he asked, his voice husky with desire. Dana chuckled softly, the sound warm and inviting. Her fingers moved to the zipper. She maintained eye contact the entire time, her gaze holding his as she reached inside and freed his size. Her touch was confident, her hand wrapping around him as she gave him a slow, deliberate stroke. Her thumb brushed lightly, and Brandon let out a soft groan, his hips lifting slightly as he responded to her touch. His hands tightened on her waist, his breathing uneven as he watched her completely captivated. "You're beautiful," he whispered, his voice filled with awe and something deeper, something that made Dana's heart race. She smiled, her eyes softening as she leaned in to kiss him again. Their lips met in a slow, deep kiss, the passion between them undeniable. Dana's hands moved to his chest, pushing his hoodie aside as she explored his body, her touch light but deliberate. Brandon's hands slipped under the hem of her bodysuit, his fingers tracing the curve of her waist before sliding up. The sensation sent a jolt of pleasure through Dana, and she moaned softly into the kiss, her hips grinding against his. The room seemed to fade away as they lost themselves in each other, their movements becoming more urgent, their kisses more fervent. Dana shifted slightly, positioning herself over him before slowly lowering herself. The sensation was overwhelming, and she let out a soft gasp, her head falling back as she took him in completely. Brandon's hands gripped her hips, their bodies perfectly in sync. The tension that had been building between them finally broke, replaced by an intense, all-consuming passion that neither of them could resist. The room was filled with the sound of their breathing, uneven, heavy, and intertwined with soft murmurs of pleasure. Dana's hands gripped Brandon's shoulders. The tension that had been simmering between them had finally boiled over, and now they were consumed by a passion that was as intoxicating as it was forbidden. Brandon's hands explored her body with a mix of admiration and desperation, his touch leaving trails of fire across her skin. His fingers traced the curve of her back, the dip of her waist, and the swell of her hips, as if he were trying to memorize every inch of her. "Breonin," she whispered, her voice trembling, with both pleasure and a hint of uncertainty. He looked up at her, his eyes dark with desire, but still carrying a trace of the boy she had raised. "I've got you," he murmured, his voice low and steady. "Just let go." His words ignited something deep within her, and Dana leaned in, capturing his lips in a searing kiss. Their tongues danced together, the kiss growing deeper and more urgent as their bodies moved in perfect harmony. Her nails dug into his shoulders, her breaths coming in short, ragged gasps as she felt herself teetering on the edge. "You're incredible," he breathed, his voice filled with awe. Their laughter mingled with their moans, the sound light and carefree, even as they teetered on the edge of something profound and life-changing. Dana felt the tension in her body coiling tighter and tighter until it finally snapped. Her body trembled, her movements slowing as she rode out the ecstasy. Brandon wasn't far behind. For a moment, they remained locked together, their breaths mingling as they came down from the high. Dana's forehead rested against his, her eyes closed as she tried to steady her racing heart. Brandon's hands slid up to cup her face, his touch gentle as he brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft and filled with concern. Dana opened her eyes, meeting his gaze with a small, reassuring smile. "I'm okay," she whispered, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. "Are you?" Brandon nodded, his expression softening. "Yeah," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm more than okay." They stayed like that for a long moment, wrapped in each other's arms, their bodies still connected in the most intimate way possible. The world outside didn't exist. There was only the two of them and the connection they had forged in this moment. Finally, Dana shifted slightly, her body slipping off his as she settled beside him on the couch. She reached for a blanket draped over the back of the couch, pulling it over them as she nestled into his side. Brandon's arm wrapped around her, his hand resting lightly on her hip as they lay there in comfortable silence. "What happens now?" Brandon asked after a while, his voice soft but tinged with uncertainty. Dana sighed, her fingers tracing idle patterns on his chest as she considered his question. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice quiet but steady. "But we'll figure it out together." Brandon nodded, his grip on her tightening slightly. "Together," he echoed, his voice filled with determination. For now, that was enough. The world outside was complicated, but in this moment, they had each other, and that was all that mattered. The room was quiet now, the only sounds, the soft rustle of the blanket and the steady rhythm of their breathing. Dana lay with her head resting on Brandon's chest, his arm draped protectively around her. The warmth of his body was comforting, but her mind buzzed with thoughts that refused to be silenced. "Brandon," she whispered, her voice breaking the stillness. "Yeah," he replied, his hand gently stroking her shoulder. Dana hesitated, searching for the right words. "This changes everything," she said softly, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Brandon shifted slightly, propping himself up on one elbow to look at her. "I know," he murmured, his gaze steady but gentle. "But it doesn't have to be bad, does it? I mean, it felt right, didn't it?" Dana's eyes softened as she met his gaze, her fingers tracing absent patterns on his chest. "It did," she admitted, her voice quiet. "But we can't pretend this is simple. There's so much at stake. Our family, our lives, the way people see us." Brandon nodded, his expression serious but thoughtful. "I get that," he said, his voice steady. "But I don't regret it. I can't. And I don't think you do either." Dana smiled faintly, her heart aching with a mix of emotions. "No, I don't," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But we have to be careful. We can't just dive into this without thinking about the consequences." Brandon reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek. "I'll follow your lead," he said, his tone firm but tender. "Whatever you want to do, I'm with you." Tears welled in Dana's eyes, and she leaned into his touch, her heart swelling with a mix of love and guilt. "You're so young," she murmured, her voice trembling. "I don't want to ruin your life." Brandon shook his head, his gaze unwavering. "You're not ruining anything," he said fiercely. "You're giving me something I didn't even know I wanted, and I'm not a kid. I know what I'm getting into." Dana sighed, her fingers curling into his chest as she tried to process his words. She knew he was serious, but she also knew the world wouldn't be kind to them if their secret ever came out. "We'll take it one step at a time," she said finally, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. "But we have to be smart about this. No one can know. Not yet. Maybe not ever." Brandon nodded, his expression serious. "I understand," he said, his tone resolute. "I'll do whatever it takes to protect this, to protect us." Dana smiled weakly, her heart aching with a mix of love and fear. She leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to his lips, their connection deepening even as the weight of what they'd done settled over them. For now, they had each other, and that would have to be enough.